Uh, Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of the public engagement program that are following the project, The Touch, which is a part of the project We Are Here, Future Ecologies, which we have done in partnership with the British Council and the Lux. This program, We Are Here, Future Ecology, was curated by Tendai Mutambu. That is the reason why we dedicated this first online public engagement program to this discussion with Tendai, so that the audience has a chance to meet Tendai and through our conversation, we are going to make the whole idea about future ecology a bit closer to the audience that will follow this online program. So Tendai, hello, and thanks for accepting the invitation to be a part of this public engagement program.
Hi, Anna. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation.
It was really a pleasure that actually my concept was accepted by British Council and Lux. It's entitled The Touch, and it was really a pleasure to work over your concept, which was in a kind given as a finished part. So we had to work and think over it and to extend it in our local context. And it was really fascinating how wide is actually the whole view of acceptance of the ecology, not just seen as, protecting our living surrounding, which is, of course, one of the most important things, and taking into consideration that our natural resources are going to be used if we don't take care about how and what do we do with the nature. But as well, talking about politics, talking about migration, talking about colonization, talking about decolonization, talking about identities, talking about medicine and industries and diseases. Actually, it all relates us to our nowadays reality that we are facing, this pandemics with COVID-19. So it really, in one unfortunately bad sense, related all together. But it gave us another reason and obligation to talk and discuss these very important issues through any kind of our public engagement, through our professions, through our different approaches in the society and everyday life. So it was really an interesting issue to work on, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to work together with you and British Council and Lux. I was really very fascinated to do it. I will just read a short note about your biography, just to give the audience what is your general profession. Tendai Mutambu is a New Zealand-based writer, editor, and curator, presently working as an acting curator at Te Uru by Takere Contemporary, assistant producer on Aura Sat's first feature, preemptive listening, and commissioning editor for Art Now essays. Tendai was until recently assistant curator of commissions and public programs at Spike Island, Bristol, where he contributed to projects on Pacita Abad, Peggy Ahvesh, Eric Baudelaire, Alvin Curran, Adam Khalil, Bailey Schweitzer, Zinzi Minot, Imran Pereta, and Laura Phillips. Other recent work includes The Couch at South London Gallery, We Are Here, work from the Lux and British Council collections, Artist in Profile, Marva Arsanios at Berwick Film and Media Art Festival, and many others. His forthcoming essays will appear in exhibition catalogs for Peggy Ahvesh's first UK solo and Ufuoma as his first major solo exhibition. So Tendai, at the very beginning of this conversation, since the point of this conversation is to be more educative and to approach a wider audience, Can you a bit describe this term moving image, which is a very important image when we talk about future ecology and about We Are Here program?
Yeah, of course. So I guess the term moving image is one that's quite common in the UK in particular, and several other places around the world, and perhaps less common in others. It's often used to talk about, I guess to put it simply, images that move, as the kind of the name itself suggests, be it film, television, forms of digital media, social media, video games, and it also encompasses pre-cinematic, what you might call pre-cinematic optical devices. So things that predated what we might call cinema today, but sort of have inklings of what would later become cinema and film, for example. And this also includes early forms of animation. And so when we talk about artist moving image in this particular case, for example, with Future Ecologies, we're referring to artists using any number of those mediums, if you will. And there are a few different institutions around the world that are dedicated to producing and sharing moving image works, including museums around the world as well. There's one in Australia, which is just, I guess, not too far from New Zealand, where I'm based, the Australian Centre of Moving Image. And there's a moving image museum, I think, in the US as well, and several other places. So yeah, that's kind of just a broad overview of what it entails.
Great, thanks for sharing this note with us, because very often when we are talking about art exhibits here, we are talking about video art or experimental art or something related to it, but very rarely related to gallery presenting videos like a moving image work of art. So that's why I thought that it will be very important to explain a bit more to the wider audience this term, so that it gets clear to them what are they going to face, mainly when they come and visit our exhibition here. You are an art historian that started working primarily as a curator in the gallery. When did you started working as a moving image curator and programs creator? What is the difference between curating in a gallery exhibition that includes different media artworks and curating projects only with moving image works?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I trained in art history, primarily at university, but I started working with what we would call artist moving image, that is artist film and video, around 2015 and 2016, not long after I'd finished studying. And this was mostly in some entry-level curatorial positions as an intern or an assistant. But my actual first attempt at curating artist film and video was in 2017 at a gallery here in New Zealand where I was working. So a colleague and I pitched a program. We had an idea which was central to the title of the program in the end. It was derived from a piece of writing or poem by a well-known New Zealand filmmaker, an experimental filmmaker called Len Lai. And the organization that we worked for was dedicated to preserving and sharing the work of Len Lai. So working on kind of conservation-related matters, archival matters, and also just helping create publications and discussions around his work. So we found a really interesting line from one of his pieces of writing that he'd made, and it kind of inspired us to, it was called, God, I feel like I think I've lost the thing, it'll come back to me, the title. The Long Dream of Waking was the title. And it sort of got us into this discussion around cinema as a place of imagination, of make-believe, a place where you can conjure up worlds that aren't necessarily accessible to you in what we might call real life. Right, so thinking about dreams and dreamscapes and things like that. And that then led my colleague and I to think about the origins of cinema and its sort of early histories, looking at some of those ideas. And so we pitched a program. Unfortunately, the gallery we worked for had an in-house cinema. So you could present programs in a proper cinema environment. People could sit down and watch it just as you go to the cinema to watch films. And it was free of access as well, or free of charge and easy to access. So that's how I kind of came to it, really. And so when I moved to the UK the following year in 2018, I applied for some trainee positions, including one at the London Film Festival through collaboration with Lux. That's how I first came into contact with Lux. Working for the London Film Festival, and I curated a program for that. And then going on from then is how I started to work on Future Ecologies. But in terms of, I think there's a question you raised about the differences between moving image and other media. So I would say, I guess, primarily the differences, film and video require, projectors and monitors and screens and all the technology that you need to play back sound. And I feel like they can be quite expensive, and quite demanding in terms of specialist knowledge that's required to to operate them and maintain them and so on and so forth. So there's a specific set of skills that go with that. And often those are skills that are, that the curator's aware of, but they don't necessarily have. You work with a big team usually, or at least you work with a team in order to realize those things, in order to present the work. But then again, when you think about paintings and so on, you require the efforts of conservators and registrars and everyone else in the museum. So it's always kind of a very collaborative effort to make things happen. But I think so often with video and film, it's easy to forget, or at least for people who aren't in those fields, to forget how much it takes in terms of labor and kind of material resourcing that's required in order for us to be able to just sit and get lost in this image, this visual in front of us. So yeah, I think by and large, there's heaps of overlap in terms of what's needed to the infrastructure to sustain presenting film and video, just as you need it to sustain other forms of art as well.
Super, great. Thanks for your answer. So the following question would be related with the project We Are Here. Actually, it contains several programs, and one of them is Future Ecology, which is dedicated to different kinds of views and approaches to ecology. But what are the other programs about?
So the other programs, so We Are Here consists of 5 thematic programs that are part of a single series. So the idea when I was approached by Ben Cook as the director of Lux was to dig into their collection, which is about 5,000 works, roughly 5,000 works, like a significant holding, I suppose, of British film and video history, if you will. So digging into their collection and British councils as well to curate these 5 programs that are thematically focused on different things. And so one of the programs is titled The Space Between. And this, for me, I kind of joke, I call this my wild card program. Out of the 4, it's sort of like, it's kind of loosely curated, really. The idea was to look at how film and video can embody and convey a different range of views on itself or on themselves as sort of as media. So thinking about the use of photography, still images, using the archival material, and how sound is used in very inventive and often very challenging ways in moving image. So essentially it's how artists, filmmakers are using the form to reflect on itself. So that was the space in between. And then there was another program, which is actually the first I curated of all the 5, titled New World Order, Old World Orders. And that one was looking at, I guess it was inspired by Brexit in part, having moved to the UK, like right in the kind of the heat of those discussions and those debates. And then also being commissioned by, I guess, a British institution in the form of British Council. In particular, I was kind of questioning what it meant to be some kind of ambassador or working on behalf of something. I mean, I'm not British myself, but I do have this kind of connection to Britain in many ways, I guess, firstly through my Zimbabwean heritage. Zimbabwe was a former colony of England, and New Zealand as well, where I live, I guess, is also a former colony. And so just thinking about those kinds of things, thinking about the British Empire, for example, had me thinking about what it means to have a collectivity that is either formed around nationhood, the idea of a nation, and how that can shift over time. And then also different forms of collectivity, like international solidarity, like movements that are built on solidarity between different countries and different places, and things of that nature. Like, I mean, to think about Great Britain as a place that holds within it many different perspectives from people who come from many different countries. So, you know, so it feels like within that one, within the UK as a nation, there are multiple nations within that. And obviously is it all the kind of contested histories that go with that in terms of colonization and so on. And then another program was Songs from a Forgotten Past, and that was looking at, I guess, thinking about what's been marginalized in terms of different histories and how artists start to bring that to the fore, and the different ways in which they start to bring those out, the choices they make in how to draw our attention to things that have been overlooked, a reframing of this history, and then also thinking about how within the kind of the debris, if you will, within the kind of the wrecks, the what do you say, the detritus of those histories, there might be little glimmers, little glimpses of hope of past projects that have failed. I think within those we can find examples of how we might rebuild them or how we might move forward, right? So it's not a case of necessarily abandoning the past completely and creating some kind of utopic future that's not connected to history. In fact, I think the seeds of what we might be able to build can be found in those past failures. I think how things fail is as instructive as how things succeed. And then the last one of these is called Radical Intimacies, and that was me looking at the sort of diverse identities that exist outside of, you know, patriarchal heterosexual norms, essentially. So thinking about queer identities and sexualities, gender nonconformity, and trying to have those conversations across generations.
Great. Thanks for explaining us a bit more about the whole program of We're Here. And now let's go again more concretely to Future Ecologies. Actually, I mentioned several of the most specific topics to which you primarily, and then we as co-curators of the whole program, are touching or reaching. But can you tell us a bit more, which is the widest area in which future ecology can be discussed? What's all considered under the term future ecologies?
I mean, that's a really good question, because there's so many different ways to approach like the question of ecology. I suppose that it sort of maybe brings to mind a very particular set of discussions and conversations. And what I was interested in was how to kind of break free from those a little bit. I'm not sure if the program necessarily succeeds in doing this, but I think some of the provocations and the artwork that's brought in from other venues, such as yours, helps to do this. Because I think there's a potential to just, to kind of oversimplify the discussion to being one around just the environment in a very limited way. But of course, if we think about the use of the word environment or even ecology, you know, it's already kind of calling on us to think more widely. Like, I mean, an environment can be anything really, right? It's sort of like the context within which something sits is its environment. It's not necessarily just like environmental in the sense of like, you know, Greenpeace or that kind of thing. So I wanted that kind of ecology, the term ecology, to be explored in its many different meanings that it could have. And necessarily, I think that in the broadest way that it kind of starts to implicate everything is that it just draws together so many different facets, to the point where it's almost very difficult for us to come to terms with, right? Like the issue is just so grave and the history so large, the impact so significant that it makes it difficult for us to start to like, how do we start to address a problem that is essentially, about to bring about the demise of what we know, everything that we have created, that we have, brought to bear on this world. So what I was interested in is how artists approach this question. How the different registers of how, in fact, how we ask, not even the answer or the solution, but like how we frame the question. All the different registers that we might bring into it, the different forms of knowledges, like non-Western knowledges, non-Western European knowledges, indigenous thinking, all these kinds of different things that might start to inform how we ask the right kinds of questions, or at least questions that aren't being asked as often. So it was thinking about how widely we can push that idea of ecology, to think about the interconnectedness of so many of our problems.
Great. So maybe through the following question and your visuals, we can, or the audience can get a closer knowledge to what do the artists that are a part of Future Ecology program talk about. So let's now start with that part.
Okay. Let's see. How's that going? Can you see the image?
Yeah, super. Everything is great.
Okay, perfect. So one of the works in the program is LHB, which was made in 2017 by Charlotte PRODGER. You might know Charlotte's work or might have heard of her through the Turner Prize, which is, I guess, the UK's most significant, most prestigious art prize, which has been going for quite some time now. And she won it for another work a few years ago. But this work is sort of in a similar vein, a similar tradition of working with mobile phone footage in particular. She thinks a lot about the kind of the framing, that device is a sort of a framing device that connects, I guess, the body to its environment in a way. There's a sense in which, you see her hold the mobile phone, and it sort of shakes and moves, and it even has, like, as with some of her other work, you see parts of the body sort of cut across the lens to sort of disrupt your view of the world outside. So there's always a sense of like something embodied, something which is connected to the body. And I really kind of like that way of looking. There was this sort of intimacy that comes out of her work with the mobile phone in a way. And so in this particular work, she was responding to her location when she did a residency, I think back in 2017 or maybe 2016. She did a 6-month artist residency in a town called Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is the kind of northernmost part of the country of England before you go to Scotland. And just to mention that Charlotte is Scottish as well, so I guess she's sort of interested in those kind of borders, those distinctions that are drawn between one territory and another. And one of the things she's also doing here, so you can kind of see a little bit in the image, is she was exploring ideas of queer rurality, or what she was calling queer rurality, which is really to do with the kind of queer desiring body, the body outside of what I mentioned before, those sort of patriarchal heterosexual norms, but how so often it's framed in the context of an urban environment as opposed to a rural one or one in the country. So here she is sort of traversing this different territory out in the wild, and she's urinating in these different places as a way of kind of marking territory, right? So for a body that has been, a body such as hers to be operating in that way, with taking such an action, starts to kind of cut across some of our ideas or our kind of instinctive responses to how women are gendered, or how they might occupy space, or the idea of like, you know, the proper way of being in the world, or actions that you might expect them to be taking and so on. And so what she did was, throughout the work, was reflecting on a trail. It's a sort of 2,600 mile long trail called the Pacific Crest Trail, and it goes from the border of Mexico all the way up to Canada. So it's like a really, really long, it cuts all the way through the US. And so she's thinking about, you know, the wilderness, and also thinking about territories and identities, because what you see now, you can see a kind of interwoven set of images, two images that have been overlaid with this kind of rectangular formation, and it references the Northumberland flag, which is, so this is Berwick upon Tweed. This is where she was making the work, or thinking about the work on her residency. And the top right there, you can see that the image of the flag, which is what's being referenced in the image just below. And of course, these ideas of these flags and, you know, kind of regional identities in the UK are so much tied to how people identify, right? You know, from like sports teams to family histories and you know, surnames and all these different kinds of things that sort of start to bring in a history of how people belong, how people tell stories of how they belong, many of which are kind of, they're quite sort of masculinist or quite patriarchal. You know, like even the idea of the surname, right, for example, or the idea of the kind of sports team, or, you know, people you might imagine sort of more readily, you know, wielding a flag and carrying sort of these markers of identity. So I think there's the idea of like, I guess that queerness is coming through. It's like how to challenge that history. And you can see on the left there, there's that's the Pacific Crest Trail, cutting across that sort of, yeah, what is it, the west coast of the country, of the US. And then another work that was included in there is Louis Henderson's All That Are Solid, which was made a bit earlier in 2014. So the format of it is like a kind of montage video, if you will. What you see is like the desktop of several computers, and then you see images of this overlaid. So it's kind of taking us into, I guess, this realm of the kind of the virtual space of, you know, the personal computer, as a place where our understanding of the world is sort of presented or mediated, something that, you know, sort of looms large in our lives, where we spend a lot of time. But what he's most interested in is that behind, you know, this idea of the kind of image that we see, all the worlds that we participate in on our computers, is a whole kind of industry, if you will, of how those images are produced. Not only as representations, but also of the actual material, you know, like the kind of the technologies, the computers, the phones, the minerals that are mined in order to be, for us to be able to have these kinds of devices. So this was quite an early work in terms of those discussions, which I think are quite common now, you know, for us to think about where all the different brands get all their, or they source all their, the minerals and the materials that are used to make the phones. So this particular work is shot in Accra, the capital of Ghana, and it's looking at some of the spaces where there's, you know, illegal mining of material, and the kind of cost of human life, the quality of life that's present in those places for the people who do all the work of mining the substances that then go into making our devices and making our experiences of these devices possible. So again, it's taking us back. There's a longer history here of colonization and colonial extraction and exploitation in Africa. That's obviously embedded within that discussion, but he's showing how that sort of is an ongoing process. It's not just a history that's ceased to be, but something that's always ongoing. And then another work, let's see, sorry, I think my computer's just frozen for a second. There we go, that's working. So that's another shot from the work. you can see this overlaying of different images, like we're looking onto someone's desktop. Here we go. So here's another work called Muti 2016 by Uriel Orlo. This one is set in South Africa, and I guess it looks at, I guess, the establishment of medicine as a field of, like a scientific field of research, but also as an industry, particularly thinking about global kind of pharmaceutical companies, or at least the impact of their presence, and the history of colonization in South Africa in particular, in as much as it relates to the slow erosion of more traditional forms of medical practice, or what equivalent they had of sort of available treatments, and the use of naturally available plant life and herbal forms and so on to treat particular ailments. So he's thinking about this history and how essentially there is a kind of a contemporary resurgence of some of these herbal practices, many of which are kind of being rediscovered, reignited by the indigenous populations, but also some of them being taken advantage or being used by some of these medical companies and so on and so forth. But what he's interested in is how we can tell a story of the nation's history, of South Africa's history, from apartheid to the present, or the kind of the beginnings of apartheid to the present. We could tell stories of how cultural forms are lost, cultural practices are challenged, eradicated. The people who practice these things are punished, to a point of I guess a post-apartheid revival of some of these practices and how they persist now. So it's an interesting work in the sense that it takes it quite like a documentary form. It takes us to some of these spaces of healing, people learning about these practices, sharing this knowledge, and yeah, significance within contemporary South African life. And then we have, so you can see here one of the nurseries as well. And then he also thinks about the naming of plants, the sort of common scientific thing of a Latin name. And then there's maybe like a corresponding English name or some other European name that corresponds to, I guess, maybe some figure who supposedly discovered a plant of some sort, and how in those names we can start to understand some of the histories of how plant life and plant forms are introduced into foreign territories and how they're used and so on. So these are some of the central questions to Orlo's work. He says, what does it mean in a country with 11 official languages, this is South Africa, and more unofficial ones besides, that these names are only available in these two languages? And I guess he was talking about, I presume, Latin and English. And then another question is, what does it mean for the epistemic violence? So, the kind of the violence of knowledge to continue today, over 20 years after the official end of apartheid. How are plants involved in the history of colonialism as active participants? What role do they play today? And then here's a quote that I found in some of the material on Orlo's website, I think. It says, quote, "The right to speak for nature is profoundly racialized, since voices raised in the protection of nature have an uneasy time escaping the scripts of race and racism." So I guess it brings to the fore the idea of who gets to speak on behalf of nature, right? When there are people who occupy that position of being, advocates for the environment. The question is, from what perspective do they speak, and on whose behalf, really? I think it's not a simple question of being like self-appointed, advocate for ecologies or the environment or someone. We have to ask ourselves, how we speak, to whom and on whose behalf, and so on. So it's not an uncomplicated thing. And so then one of the other works is, this is, maybe I can just be really short with this one. This is a work called Earth by Ben Rivers, made in 2016, and it's set in this, this kind of constructed space called Earth, URTH. Well, it's called This is the Biosphere 2. It's related to a set of experiments that happened in the late 20th century with a lot of, I guess, a lot of scientists trying to understand the question of ecology, questions around ecology and the interconnectedness of different forms of life. So understanding, I mean, the implications of this are, you know, how might we go to another planet and create sort of, or sustain life in another planet, on another planet, or perhaps as our climate begins to shift, how we might better understand our relationship to it. So the form of this work is a kind of, it's a diary that's kept by the central character, who is a woman who is supposedly the last woman on Earth, or the last person on Earth. And so she's living in this, this structure, and she's sort of logging her observations of what's taking place as she lives, you know, as the kind of, the capacity for that space to sustain her life starts to shift or starts to diminish, because obviously, you know, she uses up resources. So the idea is that the structure that actually exists. There are several around the world, but this is one is in the US, I think in Texas, and it's used by universities to do experiments on ecologies and so on and so forth. And so there's a sense of, I guess, trying to observe from a very scientific standpoint, the kind of the very stuff, the material of life, and what sustains biological life. Have a look. And this is Elizabeth Price. User group Disco is a sort of a, I don't know, I keep calling it dystopian, but I don't think that's necessarily the right word. There's a kind of a darkness to it. It's set in this imagined museum of the future, I suppose, but nothing seems to resemble like actual museum artifacts. Everything is sort of collaged together. The objects are, you know, generated by computer, and they look like a mix of kitchen utensils and statues and just different objects that just, they seem, you know, they're almost but not quite recognizable. And they sort of flow in and out of the picture with no kind of like really clear narrative that holds them together. So there's a kind of a fugitive nature to the work. You know, it's sort of hard to categorize. And what she says is, if I can just find the quote. So here's one of the shots. You can see like this kind of fountain, you know, like you might make like fondue on or something, and this looks like a grater or something, or some whisk. She says, I wanted to create a sense of being inside taxonomical categories, as if they were crumbling, dripping architecture filled with litter and debris, which I really liked, because it's a perfect description of what, you know, so being inside those categories of what is a work of art, what is not, what is a sculpture, what is worthy of being in a museum, and so on and so forth. And almost capturing a moment when those things start to fall apart. One object becomes another. It's quite surreal. There's a real surrealist kind of effect to this. And then the last one I'll just talk about really quickly is Bedwyr Williams, maybe best described by, so you can see one of the shots. It's really lush, materially quite beautiful work. There's a central figure who's narrating and talking, and they've got little bits of tile, like ceramic tiles all over, colored ceramic tiles all over their face. And so they're kind of embodying maybe a building or something architectural that sort of starts to speak back to us. And one of the central ideas is connecting, I guess, our human world to the kind of, to something sort of bigger, more vast and interstellar. So this is what he said. Bedwyr represented Wales at the Venice Biennale several years ago, I think, with this work and a larger suite of works that's based off the same research. I thought about people staring into the terrazzo, so like the tiles, which is like a universe made of tiny particles, and the people who had worshipped there. Maybe they stared into the floor, and perhaps lost themselves in the particles if, say, they were bored at a sermon. And then I thought about Galileo, who presented his telescope to the Doge in Venice, which was the first place he showed it. In a church, a telescope is a kind of enemy in a way. The church wouldn't necessarily encourage you to look too far out of space, nor too much into inner space. So there is a kind of, it starts from the very material world that you're surrounded in, right? Like the kind of physical architecture that this kind of work would occupy if it's in Venice, being shown there, of course, and thinking about the connection between, like the material that makes our world being connected to the rest of the universe, and it tells a story that's much bigger than us in terms of time, but then also thinking about these clashes between, say, religion and science, if we can draw so neat a distinction, and how in this work, though, there is a kind of interconnection of what he describes as inner and outer space, those different scales, the different sizes of ideas, of things in the world, right? That things aren't necessarily, they're not simply like, like this, the kind of what seems like the tangible world in front of us always contains within fragments of something much bigger, much broader. If we think of the history of materials, where they come from, how long they've been on Earth, this kind of the cycle of even carbon alone, right? It's like there's a connectedness to the world that just exists by dint of, things just being around us, and us, I guess, taking in some of that stuff and us being part of the world in that way. So there's a poetry to this, but the work itself is really quite funny as well. There's a nice hint of humor throughout it as well. So yeah, I've taken a while with that one. I think it's.
Oh, thank you very much for this in-depth explanation about the parts of the future ecology, the work that the audience can see here in Mala Starica in the National Gallery of Macedonia, all together with Macedonian artists. So it will help to know, for their knowledge, what they will expect here to see and what are actually the approaches and the ideas that the artists are working with. So after having this experience of yours working with this topic and having several of those presentations all over the world, what do you think? Do you think that through such events or that art can raise the awareness about the crucial questions for the future of the planet, living species, and the humankind in general? And beside ecology, very often you're working with projects that include, as we said, identity, colonization, decolonization. Actually, in a similar manner, it talks about the human power over specific groups, over others. Why do you think that this topic is important as well? And how much can we add to raising this matter of awareness between people about these questions?
To speak to just one part of that question, I think absolutely that we can think about, it allows us to think about the future of the planet, as you said, but also in the same breath to think about the history and to realize that those two things are necessarily connected. Again, it's that question I mentioned from the other program, Songs from a Forgotten Past, that there is, I guess, within the kind of the debris, if you will, the kind of remnants of those histories, it tells us something about our world, really. The kind of extent of, even say the extent of our capacity to draw connections between different forms of violence. Like I think, for example, realizing the other day that the US Army, the United States Army is a bigger polluter than 140 of the countries in the world. Not even the US as a country, but just the army alone. So to think of the kind of the cost of imperialism as like human life, the quality of life, cultures, and all the decimation that goes with the horror, but just on an environmental level, how much progress might be made if we brought an end to that kind of ongoing violence, which is sort of always, you know, there's all the things we see on the news, and then there are also all the instances of that kind of imperialist violence that we actually don't hear of on a day-to-day basis. And so I just think of the idea of how we might start to connect, say, for example, that there is a very category of human as we know it, and that there were people who were, say, not part of that category historically, like the formerly enslaved, for example, or the colonized, and that the work and the labor, the work that they put in, was what enriched the nations that are today the kind of the greatest, what do we say? So the greatest, you know, forces for degradation of the environment in a way, right? Those, I feel like these things are connected. And so when we see in the face of a climate crisis or climate crisis raging, and we see those same people who were once denied the category of human or were treated as subhuman, start to demand the dignity of you know, something that we can call, you know, livable conditions, and we see them seeking refuge, and in the process of doing so, being denied this very basic dignity by those same countries that are responsible for that. You know, it's all the things that it starts to make very clear and very evident, the kind of connections that our current predicament has to a history that is not often told, or that is not told so clearly, also honestly. And so I think in the way that, you know, some of the artists that I've included in this program, the way they start to approach some of these histories, you know, sometimes they address it overtly and directly, but sometimes they also make evident in the kind of the way that they put together their work formally, that it's not so easy. You know, the categories that we use to explain the world are only kind of, they might be convenient, or they might feel convenient in a moment, but they don't quite do justice to the language that we're using, doesn't do justice to the kind of the nature or the scope of the issues we're dealing with. That the stories we tell are only ever partial, they're only ever, you know, they're incomplete, and, you know, often subject to revision, and then also bringing into awareness the idea of from whose perspective those stories are told. So I think there is like all these questions that start to come up, and like I said before, I think these artworks really sharpen us, or they help us sharpen how we approach these issues and the kind of questions we ask. Not necessarily like providing us a solution or anything, though I think there are artists out there who are modeling different ways of working collectively, working with a certain humility of knowing that you don't have the answers, and then also drawing our attention to kind of the knowledges that have been neglected that might be incredibly useful in this moment. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Great. So having the idea that this project, Future Ecology, was actually spread into the 6 countries of Western Balkans, and in a way you have some knowledge about the concepts of all these 6 projects that are actually happening in all those 6 different countries in Western Balkans. How interesting do you see the different approaches of those 6 curators? They're all very different. They're all very inspiring. But what is your way of seeing those concepts that are actually built upon your basic idea of future ecology?
Well, I guess for me, the most inspiring thing when I was approached to do this was the fact that other people got to respond in whatever way, because it allowed for me to, I guess, to learn more. To put it simply, it was a way to learn. I had used the initial program itself, or the series, as a way to learn more about British moving image, the British film and video, and artists working within that kind of realm. And so the idea of the responses was, it also allowed me to think about how much of those ideas could be applied to different contexts. And occasionally in the process of trying to apply them to different places, it became very evident that they weren't so transferable, that there were like a different set of circumstances, geopolitical, historical, and, you know, that meant that you needed different frames of reference. And then occasionally in their applicability, it also made it very evident how kind of powerful and hegemonic so much of like Western European knowledge has been. Because, you know, the reason sometimes we kind of can operate on the same playing field or understand each other is because someone's gone and made that way of thinking the way of thinking. So this is interesting. But what I loved is, because there's so many people who were involved, one of my first questions that came up actually was how, and I might ask you this yourself, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this, but how useful is the kind of umbrella term of the Western Balkans in a way? How much does it allow us to think again of those collectives, thinking beyond the nation state, and thinking of like a collective of countries or sort of cultural affinities, things that are shared? And then also how much does it obscure for us to not think about the kind of the smaller scale cultural differences and the subtleties and so on? So I think for someone like me who's not from there, who's not so familiar with the region, there are things that I see connecting obviously those places, not only geographically, but historically, obviously. But then I'm also interested in all the different ways that I can be brought into a very specific context. So when I have a conversation with you, and then you say, okay, this is us in Macedonia, this is what it means for us to be here in 2021, going through this pandemic in this particular way, and what does it bring into focus about our situation, our political situation, our artistic histories, and things like that. So, I mean, to answer your question, is that the thing that comes out of it's just the variety of viewpoints and approaches, because I've been able to work with, or at least be in conversation with, people from all those different countries in what we would call the Western Balkans. So they give me more of a sort of more finely tuned understanding of where they're from. Yeah. And some of this has been, and you know, we had that conversation when we first met. We were part of a larger group, and we were talking about different kind of workshops and ideas, and, you know, people were presenting things in disused spaces, you know, like defunct, like architecture that's no longer being used. And there was a history about, you know, why those places existed in the way they did, collaborating with local organizations and activist groups and so on. And all that stuff really just, you know, brought to the fore the kind of the local politics of the regions and the places.
Yeah, super. Yeah, definitely gave us all a lot of new knowledge about general issues that do relate us, but as well about some particular issues that we have a chance to rise and talk and discuss, and as well introduce it to the world in a way. So as a last question, I would ask, what are your following projects? What are you working now on?
What am I working at? So at the moment, I am working with an organization called Circuit here in New Zealand. It's loosely modeled on Lux, actually. So it promotes artist moving image here in New Zealand. And they have a 10th anniversary exhibition that's coming up in June 2022. And so at the moment, I'm just working on 4 to 5 new video and film commissions from artists. I think 3 or 4 from New Zealand, and then 1 will be from the UK. And the UK-based artists we're working with, it's called Danielle Brathwaite Shirley. I can share a link to her website. she's phenomenal. Really amazing artist to look into. She works a lot with archives of Black trans histories. And she builds these really amazing animated worlds. So she uses a lot of video game technology and builds video games herself. And it's this amazing immersive world that she builds, that she creates for, you know, for other Black trans women to occupy, to have a space within which they can think about their place in the world and their histories and how they can start building something together. So yeah, I'm excited about that. We haven't confirmed the rest of the commissions, but I'm really looking forward to the project, which is, yeah, all of it looks at animation, the role of animation in artists' film and video.
Great, it sounds very exciting. So let's hope that you're going to inform us about your future moves so that we can keep on communicating and following your developing career, and probably one day have you here as a curator of some exhibition in Macedonia.
Would love that.
Yeah, Tendai, thanks for your time. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for being a part of this public engagement program. Let's hope that the audience will like to come and see what we together have prepared for them. And let's thanks once more British Council and Lux for giving us both the opportunity to work on this program, and see you in near future.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks to you and your team for organizing this.
It was a pleasure, definitely.
Cool.
See you soon. Bye.
See you soon.